Don't move! Step away from the child!
He's dying.
Dawn broke slowly over the eastern ridge, pale light spilling across a riverbank stained deep crimson. Mist hovered low over the water, clinging to reeds and broken stone. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to sting the throat. Birds had long since fled the trees. Even the river seemed to move more quietly, as if it understood something terrible had happened in the night. The hunting party found her crouched in the mud near the water's edge. She was small, slight, her gray dress soaked dark with blood and river water. Mud clung to her knees and hands. Strands of chestnut hair stuck to her tear-streaked face. In her arms she cradled something small and terribly still. A Packless Omega. Eliza Whitmore did not look up when the first warrior stepped forward. She did not bare her throat in submission. She did not try to run. She only held the child tighter against her chest. The warriors formed a circle around her, boots sinking into wet soil. 20 hardened wolves, scarred and armed, their weapons drawn. The smell reached them all at once, royal blood. Pup blood. One of them inhaled sharply. Another's hand tightened around his sword hilt. Then the ground itself seemed to shift. The circle parted. Alpha King Alaric Blackthorn stepped through. He was massive, towering well over the tallest of his warriors, broad shoulders wrapped in dark leather and fur. Old battle scars carved pale lines across his arms and throat. His presence pressed against the air like a storm about to break. Gold had already flooded his eyes, molten and burning, his wolf close to the surface. In his hand he carried the ancient ceremonial spear carved from ironwood, its shaft marked with generations of kings. The sharpened tip lowered slowly until it hovered inches from Eliza's heart. Step away from the cub. His voice was not raised, yet it carried absolute command. Eliza's lips trembled. He's dying, she whispered. The words barely carried across the circle, but every wolf heard them. Gideon Hayes, the king's beta, stepped forward, his face twisted with fury. You killed Prince Theodore, he snarled. You killed the king's nephew. A low growl rippled through the warriors. The scent confirmed it. The blood in the mud was royal. The small body in her arms bore the unmistakable silver-brown markings of Blackthorn lineage. Eliza finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes were swollen from crying, wide and raw, not with fear but grief. No, she said hoarsely. She shifted slightly, and the warriors saw it clearly, the deep gashes across the child's torso, the torn flesh, the dark swelling around the wounds. Shadowhawks. Eliza raised one trembling hand while keeping the other cradling the boy's head. Her palm was shredded, skin torn and bleeding. Long scratches carved across her forearms, some shallow, some deep enough to still seep red. I fought them off, she said. They were feeding when I found him. The circle wavered. Gideon's snarl softened into something uncertain. I scared them away, she continued, voice breaking. There were 3 of them. I grabbed rocks, I screamed, I threw myself at them. Mud streaked her cheek as fresh tears fell. I've been carrying him for 4 hours. I was trying to get back to your territory. A murmur passed through the warriors. Her own settlement lay in the opposite direction, miles away across neutral ground that often turned hostile. A lone Omega would be easy prey there. Alaric's spear did not move, but his eyes narrowed. Why? He demanded. The question cracked through the silence. Why would you risk yourself for a pup that is not yours? A pack that is not yours? Eliza swallowed, clutching the boy tighter. Because he's a child. The simplicity of it struck harder than any defense. Her voice trembled as she spoke again. When I found him, he was still conscious. He was scared. He kept calling for his mother. He kept asking when his uncle would come save him. Her eyes lifted, meeting the king's molten gaze. He didn't understand why he was in pain. The circle of warriors shifted uneasily. They could smell the truth in her grief. Omegas were many things, gentle, nurturing, fiercely protective of young, but killers of pups? That defied instinct itself. Gideon knelt briefly beside the child, inspecting the wounds without touching. His jaw tightened. Shadowhawk venom, he said quietly. It's already in his bloodstream. The words fell like a death sentence. No healer could reverse it. No speed could outrun it. Alaric's spear lowered an inch. Eliza bowed her head over the small body, rocking slightly. I ran as fast as I could, she whispered. I thought if I could just get him home. The king studied her, the torn hands, the defensive wounds, the exhaustion hollowing her cheeks. The scent of fear was present, yes, but not for herself. For the child. A silence settled over the riverbank as the realization spread among the warriors. Prince Theodore would not survive. and the Packless Omega holding him had not been his executioner. She had been his shield. The dawn light strengthened, pale gold spilling across the riverbank, catching in the streaks of blood that stained the mud. The circle of warriors stood in tense silence, their breaths misting faintly in the cool morning air. In Eliza Whitmore's arms, the small body shifted. It was subtle at first, a tremor beneath her trembling hands. Then a shallow inhale, sharp and uneven. Prince Theodore's eyelids fluttered. A collective breath caught in 20 throats. His eyes opened halfway, clouded with pain and confusion. The bright blue that marked royal lineage was dulled, unfocused, searching. "It hurts," he whispered. The words were not spoken in the common tongue. They came in the ancient language of wolves, older than pack boundaries, older than crowns, older than law. It was a language carried in blood and bone, understood instinctively by all. Eliza answered him in that same ancient tongue without hesitation. "I know, little one," she murmured. His small fingers twitched against her dress, gripping weakly. "Mama," he breathed. The word broke something fragile in the air. He turned his face slightly, searching blindly. "Mama. I want Mama." Eliza's lips trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "She loves you," she whispered. His gaze shifted again, unfocused and drifting. "Uncle Alaric?" he asked faintly. "Where is he?" "He'll come. He always comes." Across the circle, the Alpha King stood motionless, golden eyes burning brighter. Theodore blinked slowly, trying to focus on the woman holding him. His expression softened. "Are you my mama?" he asked. The question was barely audible. Eliza's breath hitched in her chest. "You smell nice," he continued weakly. "Like sunshine and honey. Like safe." Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "No, sweetling," she whispered, pressing her forehead gently to his. "I'm not your mama. But I'm here." His small hand moved again, clutching at her collar. "Will you stay?" he asked. "I'll stay," she promised immediately. "I won't leave you." The wind stirred faintly along the canyon walls. She bent her head and pressed her lips to his forehead. The kiss was soft, reverent, lingering, a gesture as old as wolves themselves. A promise that he would not cross into darkness alone. When she lifted her head, she began to hum. The sound was low at first, barely more than breath. Then it deepened, rising and falling in a melody older than language. The Omega Lullaby. Every wolf was born knowing it. It was the sound of safety in a den. The warmth of a mother's body. The steady heartbeat that told a pup the world was not ending. The warriors felt it in their bones. Hardened fighters who had faced rogue packs and battlefields found their throats tightening unexpectedly. Their wolves stirred restlessly beneath their skin, recognizing the sacredness of the song. Theodore's breathing slowed. The tension in his small body eased little by little. His fingers loosened their desperate grip. The fear drained from his eyes. He blinked once more, looking up at her as if trying to memorize her face. "Mama," he whispered again. Eliza brushed damp hair from his forehead. "She loves you," she murmured softly. "She's waiting for you. You're not alone." His chest rose. Fall. Rose again, shallower this time. Then stilled. The silence that followed was immense. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sound tore from Eliza's throat. It was not a scream. Not a cry. It was a keening wail that seemed to rip from somewhere primal and ancient. The grief howl of a mother who had lost her pup. It echoed against the canyon walls, bounced across the river, carried by the wind into the trees. Raw. Unrestrained. Devastating. She rocked back and forth in the mud, clutching Theodore's small body to her chest as if refusing to surrender him to stillness. The warriors felt it like a blade between their ribs. One sword slipped from nerveless fingers and fell into the mud with a dull thud. Another clattered beside it. One by one, weapons dropped until steel and wood lay scattered across the blood-soaked ground. At the center of the circle, Alaric Blackthorn stood unmoving. His golden eyes were locked on the Omega who cradled his nephew. Something fractured behind that molten gaze. The ancient ironwood spear slipped from his grasp. It struck the mud heavily, the sacred weapon of kings resting in the dirt for the first time outside of triumph or ceremony. The Alpha King did not seem to notice. His attention was fixed entirely on the sight before him, on the small, packless Omega grieving as though the child had been born of her own body. In that moment, strength and dominance meant nothing. The rules of hierarchy, the politics of pack, the boundaries of blood, all of it fell away beneath the weight of what she had done. She had held a royal prince while he died. She had given him comfort instead of fear. She had sung him into whatever waited beyond. The canyon held its breath. The warriors bowed their heads instinctively, not to their king, but to the sacred grief unfolding before them. And in the crimson mud of the riverbank, Eliza Whitmore ceased to be merely packless. She became something older, something revered, something sacred. The echo of Eliza's grief faded slowly into the canyon walls, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than battle. The warriors stood with heads bowed, their weapons abandoned in the mud. No one dared move first. Alaric Blackthorn did. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, as though approaching something fragile instead of the aftermath of death. The mud pulled at his boots, dark water soaking into the hem of his cloak, but he did not seem to notice. Eliza still rocked gently where she knelt, cradling Prince Theodore's small, lifeless body. Her humming had faded into quiet, broken breaths. Mud streaked her dress. Blood, some hers, most his, had dried in dark patches against the gray fabric. Alaric stopped before her. For a moment, the king of the Northern Territories simply looked. Up close, he could see everything the distance had hidden. The torn skin of her palms. The long, ragged scratches carved into her forearms. The swelling bruises forming along her collarbone where talons must have struck. Her face was pale beneath the mud, lips trembling from exhaustion and shock. She had fought. She had carried the prince for miles. She had sung until the very end. Alaric lowered himself to one knee in the mud. The motion drew a sharp intake of breath from several warriors. Kings did not kneel outside ceremony. They did not lower themselves in blood-soaked earth beside packless omegas. But he knelt. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer edged with command. "Give him to me," he said quietly. "I will carry him home." Eliza lifted her tear-blurred gaze toward him. For a moment, she did not move, as if afraid the child might vanish if she loosened her grip. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I tried. I ran as fast as I could." Her voice broke and fresh tears slid down her cheeks. "I fought them. I screamed. I tried to keep him awake. I thought if I could just reach your territory." Her words dissolved into sobs. Alaric did not interrupt her this time. "I couldn't save him," she whispered. "I did everything I could." "You gave him comfort," Alaric replied steadily. The words cut through her apologies. He was not alone. He was not afraid at the end. His golden eyes softened. "That is no small gift." Eliza stared at him as though she did not understand. "You fought shadow hawks with your bare hands," he continued. "You carried a royal child across dangerous land, knowing he would likely die in your arms. You sang him into peace." His voice deepened, carrying across the circle of warriors. "In my pack, such courage is honored." A murmur rose from the gathered wolves, low, solemn agreement. "In my kingdom," Alaric declared, "you are protected." The statement rang with authority, binding as law. He held her gaze a moment longer before speaking again, more quietly. "And in my heart, you are family." The words seemed to strike her harder than any accusation had earlier. She swallowed, glancing down at Theodore's still form before carefully shifting him into Alaric's waiting arms. The prince looked impossibly small against the king's broad chest. Eliza remained kneeling a moment longer before slowly rising to her feet. She swayed slightly, exhaustion threatening to pull her back to the ground. "I want to come with you," she said hoarsely. Alaric's eyes lifted to hers. "To your pack," she continued. "I need to tell his mother that I tried. I need her to know he wasn't alone, that he was loved." Silence stretched between them. Then Alaric nodded once. "You will come." He rose to his full height, Theodore cradled securely against him. "Gideon," he called. The beta stepped forward immediately. "Send runners ahead. Inform the pack that we return with Prince Theodore." His jaw tightened briefly. "Tell them he was not alone." "Yes, my king." Gideon moved quickly, signaling two warriors who shifted and sprinted ahead across the terrain. The remaining wolves retrieved their weapons, not in threat but in preparation. They reformed around Alaric and Eliza, not as captors surrounding a suspect, but as guardians shielding something precious. Alaric shifted Theodore carefully to one arm and extended the other toward Eliza. The offered arm hung in the space between them. She stared at it. An Alpha King's support. Freely given. Her fingers trembled. "I don't bite," Alaric said lightly, a faint edge of dry humor in his tone. "Not Omegas who fight shadow hawks, at least." A faint, incredulous breath escaped her. Slowly she reached forward. Her hand barely circled his forearm, fingers smudged with dried blood and mud. He adjusted his stance instinctively, steadying her. Together they began to walk. The riverbank fell behind them, the crimson mud slowly fading into grass and stone. The canyon walls loomed silent witness as the formation moved forward. The king carried his fallen nephew. At his side walked the Omega who had held him through death. And the warriors followed, not guarding a prisoner but protecting one of their own, as they turned toward Blackthorn territory and whatever awaited them there. By the time the Blackthorn territory gates came into view, the sun stood high and unforgiving overhead. The journey back had been silent. Boots struck stone in steady rhythm. No one spoke. No one dared. News had traveled faster than they had. The streets were lined before they even reached the outer courtyard. Hundreds of wolves stood in human form along the main path leading toward the pack house. Men and women, elders and young warriors, servants and guards. Not a single voice rose above a whisper. Not a single movement disturbed the heavy air. Heads bowed as their king walked through. Alaric Blackthorn carried his nephew against his chest, the small body wrapped now in a cloak, though the outline of his frame was unmistakable. His expression was carved from stone, golden eyes dimmed but unbroken. Beside him walked Eliza Whitmore. Her dress had been cleaned as best as possible during the march, but faint stains remained. Her hands were bandaged with strips torn from a warrior's spare cloth. She kept her gaze low, painfully aware of the eyes tracking her every step. Whispers rippled along the edges of the crowd. She's packless. She doesn't carry our scent. Why is the king touching her? Is that blood on her? The murmurs died as quickly as they began when Alaric's gaze lifted slightly. No words were needed. The warning in his posture was enough. At the entrance to the pack house stood Eleanor Blackthorn. She did not move as they approached. Her silver-streaked hair fell loose over her shoulders, her pale dress shifting faintly in the wind. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the bundle in her brother's arms. "Alaric," she said, her voice barely audible. She did not ask how it had happened. She asked only one thing. "Is he gone?" The courtyard seemed to shrink around the question. Alaric stopped a few steps before her. For a brief moment, the fierce Alpha King hesitated. Then he nodded. Yes. The single word shattered her. Eleanor's knees buckled as if the strength had been pulled from her bones. A sound tore from her throat, raw and animal, grief stripped of dignity. She would have collapsed fully if Gideon had not stepped forward, catching her before she struck the stone. Carefully, gently, Alaric lowered Theodore into her arms. The moment his small body touched her chest, the bond between mother and child surged like lightning through the pack. Every wolf felt it. The hollow echo where a living presence had once been. A collective ache rippled outward. Eleanor rocked back and forth, clutching her son tightly, pressing her face into his hair. Her cries filled the courtyard, breaking against stone walls and open sky. No one moved. No one interrupted. When at last her gaze lifted, wild and glassy with pain, Alaric spoke softly. "There is someone you must meet." He stepped aside slightly. Eliza stood frozen where she was, eyes red and swollen, shoulders trembling. "This is Eliza Whitmore," Alaric said. "She found Theodore after Shadow Hawks attacked." The courtyard stilled further. "She fought them off with her bare hands," he continued. "She carried him for 4 hours across dangerous ground trying to reach us." Eleanor's breathing hitched. Alaric's voice deepened. She held him as he passed. She sang to him so he would not be afraid. The words settled over the gathered wolves like sacred testimony. Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, still cradling her son. Her eyes locked onto Eliza's face. For a heartbeat, fear flashed through Eliza. She expected accusation, blame, fury. Instead, Eleanor stepped forward. She stopped only inches away. "You were with my son," she whispered. Eliza nodded, tears spilling anew. "I tried," she choked. "I ran as fast as I could. I'm so sorry." Eleanor shifted Theodore carefully into one arm. Then she pulled Eliza into her embrace. The gesture stunned the crowd into complete silence. The royal mother held the packless Omega tightly, her fingers gripping the back of her dress. "Thank you," Eleanor breathed against her shoulder. "Thank you for loving him when I could not be there." Eliza broke entirely then, sobbing into the woman's embrace. Around them, wolves lowered their heads in respect. They had expected rage. They witnessed gratitude. Alaric watched it all without speaking. Only when the courtyard began to disperse slowly, wolves retreating with subdued steps, did he turn slightly toward Gideon. "She is staying," he said quietly. Gideon glanced at him. "The council will object." Alaric's jaw tightened. "They may," he replied evenly. "They are welcome to challenge me." His gaze returned to Eliza and Eleanor, still standing together in shared grief. She is Pack now. The declaration carried the weight of law, even spoken in near whisper. Gideon bowed his head once. Yes, my king. And as the courtyard emptied and the pack carried its sorrow inward, one truth settled firmly into the foundation of Blackthorn territory. The Omega who had held a prince in his final breath would not walk these streets as an outsider again. 3 days after the funeral rites, the royal burial grounds lay quiet beneath a gray sky. Fresh earth marked the place where Prince Theodore had been laid to rest among generations of Blackthorn blood. The scent of incense and turned soil still lingered faintly in the air. Beyond the solemn stones and carved markers, the packhouse gardens stretched wide and green. Ancient oaks cast long shadows over trimmed paths and low stone benches. It was there that Eliza Whitmore sat alone. She wore a new dress, deep blue, simple but finely made. The pack's seamstresses had insisted. The fabric fell clean and unmarked, a quiet replacement for the blood-soaked gray that had been burned after her arrival. Yet she sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, posture small, as if unsure whether she had the right to occupy the space. She stared at nothing in particular. The garden gate creaked softly. Alaric Blackthorn entered without an escort. He paused briefly when he saw her beneath the oak, then walked toward her at an unhurried pace. The afternoon light caught the faint lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes. Grief had not left him, but it had settled into something quieter. Eliza. She startled slightly and immediately began to rise to her feet. He lifted a hand. Stay. She hesitated, then sank back onto the bench. Alaric stopped before her and, after a brief pause, gestured to the empty space beside her. May I? The question alone startled her more than anything else had in the past 3 days. She nodded. He lowered himself beside her, resting his forearms on his knees in a posture far less regal than the throne room required. For a few moments neither of them spoke. The funeral rites are complete, he said finally. He rests among his ancestors. Eliza swallowed and nodded once. My sister has asked that you remain, he continued. She says you were the last to hold him. That you understand something no one else here can. Eliza's gaze dropped to her hands. I can stay for a little while, she said quietly, until she feels stronger. Then I should return to the border territories. I don't want to cause unrest. You are not leaving. The firmness in his voice was not harsh, but it carried finality. She looked up at him, confusion and uncertainty written plainly across her face. I have already registered you with the council, he said. The formal decree has been recorded. Her eyes widened. Registered. The law permits an Alpha King to claim any wolf into his pack for acts of exceptional bravery or service to the crown. Eliza shook her head slightly. But I'm packless. I have no sponsor. People will talk. People always talk, Alaric replied evenly. Let them. Her voice trembled. They will say I used his death to secure position. His expression hardened, not at her but at the implication. Anyone who witnessed what happened at that riverbank knows better, he said. Anyone who doubts it may address me directly. The weight behind that statement left little room for argument. You will live in the main house, he continued. You will dine at my table. You will walk these grounds without lowering your eyes. She stared at him, breath unsteady. If any wolf finds issue with that arrangement, they answer to me. Silence stretched between them. Why? She asked at last. The question was soft, but it carried far more than simple curiosity. Alaric leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the towering oak above them. Because when I saw you holding him, he said slowly, I remembered something I had forgotten. She waited. That strength without compassion is cruelty, he said. That power without mercy is hollow. His eyes returned to hers. You restored something in me that I believed buried. A faint shift rippled beneath his skin, subtle but unmistakable to a wolf's senses. His wolf stirred closer to the surface, alert, attentive. Mate. The word whispered through him like a shock of recognition. He had not felt that pull in years. Had convinced himself he never would again. Yet as he looked at her, mud-streaked memory replaced by quiet resilience, he felt it. Not forced. Not claimed by law. Simply there. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. I will not command you to stay, he said, voice lower now. I am asking. The difference was unmistakable. Stay, he continued, meeting her gaze fully. Not because of obligation. Not because of law. But because I would have you here. The vulnerability in the admission surprised even him. Eliza's breath caught. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. "You are not." His reply came without hesitation. She studied him carefully, searching for doubt, for hidden motive, for political calculation. She found none. Only quiet resolve. After a long moment she nodded. "Then I will stay." Relief flickered across his features, subtle but genuine. The wind shifted gently through the garden leaves, carrying away the last of the funeral incense. And beneath the shade of the ancient oak, something fragile and unspoken took root, neither decree nor duty but the beginning of choice. 6 months passed. Not in a single sweeping change but in quiet, deliberate steps. Winter loosened its grip on the northern territories, frost melting from stone paths and palace rooftops. Snow gave way to thawing earth. The pack moved forward as packs always did, carrying grief not as a wound but as a scar. And within that slow turning of seasons, something else began to grow. Alaric Blackthorne did not claim Eliza Whitmore in a public ceremony. He did not bind her to him by decree or law. Instead he chose patience. Their courtship unfolded in measured moments. Walks along the forest perimeter where guards trailed at a respectful distance. Conversations beneath the ancient oaks of the garden. Shared silences that did not demand words. He listened when she spoke. That alone changed everything. He asked about the border territories where she had once lived. About the loneliness of being packless. About the way she had survived without protection. She in turn asked about the weight of the crown. About the burden of ruling wolves who expected strength but rarely saw the cost of it. Trust did not appear overnight. It built carefully, brick by brick, through honesty and restraint. He never touched her without permission. She never lowered her gaze to him out of fear. Eleanor Blackthorne became the bridge between them. The grieving mother who had once collapsed in the courtyard now spent mornings with Eliza in the kitchens, teaching her old family recipes. Laughter returned in small, unexpected bursts. Shared stories of Theodore became less about loss and more about memory. Eleanor began to treat Eliza not as an outsider but as a sister. She braided her hair before formal gatherings. She corrected servants who hesitated to show proper respect. She stood at Eliza's side during pack events without hesitation. The pack noticed. Acceptance did not arrive all at once, but resistance faded steadily. Warriors who had once whispered now nodded respectfully in passing. Elders invited her to sit closer during council observances. Pups followed her in the courtyard gardens, drawn instinctively to her calm presence. Eliza did not force belonging. She earned it. And Alaric watched. He softened over those months in ways he had not allowed himself in years. The rigid edge of constant vigilance eased. The lines carved into his brow lessened. Laughter, rare and quiet, returned to his voice when she teased him gently about his grim expressions during council sessions. He found himself seeking her company without excuse. Not because duty required it, because he wanted it. There were evenings spent near the hearth, the fire casting warm gold across stone walls as they spoke in low tones about nothing and everything. She would sit close enough for their shoulders to brush and neither would pull away. The bond between them was never forced. It was chosen. Again and again. Shared grief had been the soil where it began. But healing became the water that sustained it. One evening in early spring, as the last of winter frost disappeared from the valley, Alaric stood beside her at the balcony overlooking the territory. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No. It was already here." He looked at her then, not as a king assessing loyalty but as a man recognizing truth. Love did not arrive with thunder or dominance. It arrived in stillness. In the way her hand fit naturally against his when he offered it. In the way she no longer flinched at his nearness. In the way his wolf settled peacefully instead of prowling restlessly. The realization came not as surprise but as certainty. He loved her. And when he finally told her, there was no spectacle. No command. No claim. Only quiet words spoken under an open sky. She answered without hesitation. And in that moment, the bond that had begun in blood and sorrow became something entirely their own, steady, deliberate, and freely given. Morning light spilled through the tall arched windows of the king's chambers, warm and golden, stretching across polished stone floors and woven rugs. The heavy drapes had been left open, allowing the sun to flood the room in quiet brilliance. Outside, the territory stirred awake, distant voices, the faint clang of training weapons, the scent of baking bread drifting upward from the kitchens. Eliza Whitmore opened her eyes slowly. For a moment she lay still, listening to the steady rhythm beneath her ear. An arm rested securely around her waist, broad and warm. The familiar weight of it no longer startled her. She turned her head slightly. Alaric Blackthorn slept beside her, his expression softened in a way few had ever witnessed. Without the sharp edge of command, without the mantle of authority resting visibly on his shoulders, he looked younger, peaceful. The tension that once carved deep lines into his brow had eased over time. Even in sleep he no longer appeared braced for battle. A faint smile tugged at her lips. "You're staring?" he murmured, eyes still closed. She startled slightly. "I am not." One golden eye cracked open. "You are." She shifted closer in playful defiance. "You snore." "I do not." "You do." A low rumble of amusement vibrated in his chest. Terrifying accusation. She laughed softly, the sound light and unguarded. He opened his eyes fully then, gaze warm rather than molten. "How did I get so fortunate?" She tilted her head. "You were brave enough to change." He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, fingers lingering at her temple. "You reminded me how." Outside the chamber doors, footsteps moved briskly down the corridor. The pack was awake and alive. "Eliza," he said more quietly, his tone shifting. "My sister asked us to join her for breakfast." She nodded. "She said she's making Theodore's favorite." A brief silence passed between them, not heavy, not crushing. "Today," Eliza added gently, "she wants to remember him with joy." Alaric's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the sunlight stretching across the valley. "She's healing," he said. "So are you." He looked back at her. "So are we," she corrected softly. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with easy familiarity. "I love you," he said. There was no grandeur in the declaration. No audience. No ceremony. Only truth. Her answering smile held equal certainty. "I love you too." He leaned forward and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her forehead. The gesture was tender, unhurried, a reflection of something once born in grief and now rooted in devotion. When they rose and dressed, they did so side by side. Not king and outsider. Not protector and rescued. Partners. They walked together through the corridors of the pack house, sunlight chasing them from window to window. Servants bowed as they passed, not out of obligation alone but respect. In the kitchens, Eleanor Blackthorn stood before the hearth, sleeves rolled, silver hair pinned loosely back. The scent of honeyed oats and fresh bread filled the room. She looked up as they entered. For a heartbeat, the shadow of loss crossed her features. Then she smiled. "Come," she said. "It's his favorite." They sat at the long wooden table. No formal council seats. No throne. Just family. Conversation moved gently, memories shared, small stories recalled. Laughter came easier than it once had. The pain was still present, but it no longer ruled the room. Alaric watched the two women across from him. The sister who had survived unimaginable grief and the Omega who had carried that grief with her. His kingdom had not changed because of force. It had changed because of mercy. Strength alone had built the walls. Compassion had made them worth defending. He reached for Eliza's hand beneath the table, squeezing it lightly. The pack beyond those walls thrived. Disputes were handled with firmness, yes, but also fairness. Warriors trained hard but without cruelty. Elders were consulted. Pups were protected not merely by law, but by shared understanding. Love had not weakened his rule. It had strengthened it. Later, as they stepped onto the balcony overlooking the territory, Eliza stood beside him, her presence no longer questioned. The wind lifted her hair gently, sunlight catching in its strands. "You've built something different," she said. "No," he replied quietly. "We have." She looked out over the valley, over wolves who now moved with purpose rather than fear. "Power," she said thoughtfully, "doesn't have to dominate." He nodded. "Strength without compassion is cruelty. And real power," she added, "is mercy." He turned to her, golden eyes steady and certain. "Sometimes," he said, "the greatest force in this world is an Omega's love." She smiled at that. A king who once measured worth in dominance now understood something far more enduring. Sometimes the truest strength was choosing to feel. Choosing to soften. Choosing to love, every single day. And in the sunlight of the Northern Territories, the Alpha King and his Omega Queen stood side by side. Proof that kingdoms are not rebuilt by crowns or spears, but by hearts brave enough to change. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories.